I'm Judy Shaw for NYSE Floor Talk. I'm here at NYSE West in San Francisco, and joining me today is Brennan Spellacy. He is CEO and co-founder at Patch. Brennan, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Judy. Really appreciate it.
Well, I am very eager to talk with you, but before we do that, just a quick note to viewers. This interview is for informational purposes only. The NYSE doesn't recommend any investments or investment strategies. All right, so Brennan, tell me, why is it important to you to save the planet?
Well, I mean, it's worth saving, right? It's one of the only planets we have. I mean, I certainly have the aspiration and hope that we'll be a multi-planetary species at some point, but there are going to be several billion of us that still have to live here on planet Earth, and so it's worth preserving this pale blue dot we have.
Mm-hmm. All right, so talk to me about Patch and tell me about your mission.
Absolutely. So Patch is a climate technology business. So what that means is if you take a step back, we're still not doing enough as a civilization to fight climate change. When you look at a net zero future, there's going to be really two major components to it. The first is decarbonization. How do you pollute less? How do we emit fewer greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane? And then the second piece is how do you remove carbon? How do you take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's already been emitted over the last 150 years? Patch aims to make that last piece, the carbon removal element, easier for businesses and policymakers, where we actually build software that makes it easy for enterprises to transact within what are called voluntary carbon markets.
Okay, so tell me, how are you different from others that are in this space?
Yeah, so normally the way people interact and transact within carbon markets are through a series of brokers, typically very sales and people-led organizations. Patch is very much a financial and software engineering business, where instead of purchasing carbon credits, marking them up, and reselling them, what we actually do is we build software, the software called Carbon OS, where we work really closely with the carbon credit developers and kind of embed ourselves within those businesses. We then aggregate all that information and expose it to end buyers. So for us, we don't have a position in which carbon credits actually get bought versus not. What we actually want to enable is servicing a huge new level of information to actual end buyers, to drive trust within the market by exposing them to information that historically has been obstructed or opaque because of the existing broker networks.
All right, and as you look to the year ahead, what are you most focused on?
Primarily two things. The first is this Carbon OS element I mentioned earlier. So we build software for carbon credit developers to help them scale their business, whether that's inventory management, payments, localization. If you're a carbon credit developer in Canada, how do you sell in Japan or somewhere else abroad? We help manage that information complexity. And that's a huge focus area of us where we've just announced this last week, where we're going to be investing incredibly heavily. The second element is how do we actually enable enterprises to take climate action more quickly? There's this concept we like to describe as the implementation gap, where we've seen a huge number of, whether it's banks, corporates actually making climate claims, but how do you actually narrow the gap where you're going from claim to actually implementation? So companies like EQT, for example, over $100 billion AUM private equity firm based in Stockholm, they actually use Patch to operationalize their sustainable expertise, where they can use the software to deploy capital within carbon markets.
All right, and finally, there is the Carbon Conference that's taking place here in San Francisco right now, which you have been attending. Talk to me about the takeaways from the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. So Credit Suisse put on an absolutely fantastic event. It's the third version of this event, the Carbon Negative Conference 3.0, which they called it, where really there's two kind of core stakeholder groups at this event. There's investors, so who's actually really excited about the emerging world of CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, and then there are actually the CDR companies. For us, this is actually the two sets of stakeholders we really care about, where it's the actual folks that are going to be using Carbon OS and the carbon credit developers, as well as the capital allocators who typically use Patch as a software solution. The core takeaway that's really kind of becoming clearer and clearer is this idea of how do we continue to drive more capital within to CDR. If you, again, think about that net zero future, it's going to be around an 80-20 split between decarbonization and carbon removal, where we need to remove about 10 gigatons per year. Right now, we're spending not even 1% we need to be spending on an annualized basis on carbon dioxide removal. So a huge theme of the conference was, well, how do we open up the gates? How do we use software, financial engineering to drive transparency and trust within the ecosystem to enable this level of investment we're going to need in order to hit our climate goals?
All right, well, Brennan, wonderful to talk with you. Thanks for joining me on Floor Talk today.
Thank you so much for having me, Judy.